everyone. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive here on the Unseen Wisdom.
Yeah, always good to be back.
So this one's going to be a tough one. Folks out there, you've sent us a lot of stuff about Cwecwe.
Right.
You know, you send us news reports and this one podcast featuring Cwecwe's mom, and it's really difficult stuff.
Yeah.
So we wanted to do a deep dive into this case today.
Absolutely.
Just so everyone listening knows the basics here. This is about a 7-year-old girl allegedly raped at her school back in October of last year in the Eastern Cape of South Africa.
Yeah.
And we want to look at, obviously what happened there, what we know, and then also look at, how difficult the path to justice is in these kinds of certifications.
Yeah, absolutely.
In South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to cut through all the noise and just focus on what's really important here and give you guys a clear and thorough understanding of this case.
Right.
And we should probably mention off the bat, this has gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been a lot of marches in several different provinces,
Right.
Demanding justice for Cwecwe.
Exactly.
Which we've seen reported in Newsroom Africa and ENCA.
Yeah.
So clearly this is a case that has resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly upsetting, and it really brings to light a lot of the huge systemic issues we see in South Africa.
For sure.
Um,
So, okay, let's start off, where any deep dive starts with the basic facts here.
Sure.
What do we actually know about what happened?
Right.
So the initial reports came out of Newsroom Africa,
Okay.
and they gave these basic details saying that Cwecwe was allegedly raped in October 2024 at her school in Manadilla in the Eastern Cape
Right.
while she was waiting for transport
Okay.
after school.
Yeah, it's awful. And I think what's really been striking about this case is how the community has reacted.
Oh, yeah.
They've really refused to let this case fade away.
Absolutely.
And that's led to those marches
Yeah.
across multiple provinces that you mentioned, like in the Eastern Cape itself, but also in KwaZulu-Natal and even in Gauteng,
Yeah.
all demanding justice.
Yeah. And I mean, there have been some repercussions from that, Newsroom Africa also reported that the school actually received a notice to deregister,
Oh, wow.
and that's led to learners being displaced,
Yeah.
which is a pretty major disruption to their education.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it really highlights how seriously people are taking this case.
Yeah. And I think it's important to consider, ENCA pointed out that this case, as horrible as it is, sadly isn't an isolated incident.
Right.
This is just one example of this much larger problem of gender-based violence
Oh, exactly.
that we have in South Africa.
It's endemic. I mean,
Yeah,
ENCA mentioned the case of 6-year-old Amat Samani.
right.
It also brought up the acquittal in the Timothy Omoto case.
Yeah.
And these are just two examples that they highlighted, but they really illustrate this huge frustration that people have with the justice system and this feeling that it's failing victims
Absolutely.
of GDV.
Yeah.
So, you can see why people are so angry and so vocal about Cwecwe's case.
Yeah, I mean, it fits into this pattern that people have seen again and again.
Exactly.
And it's really troubling, and a lot of that frustration seems to be focused on the principal of the school and the whole DNA investigation.
Yeah.
We have conflicting accounts about what happened here.
Right.
The MEC for Education apparently came out and said that the principal was listed in SAPS records as a suspect
Oh, wow.
and was avoiding providing a DNA sample by seeking legal counsel,
Oh, that's...
which sounds
You know,
bad.
That does sound serious.
Um,
It's interesting, though, because AfriForum's private prosecutions unit, they came out and said something completely different.
right.
They basically said that the police have mishandled this investigation,
Oh, wow.
that they spread misinformation,
Okay.
and that the evidence doesn't support the principal being a suspect at all. They even went so far as to say that this whole thing is making a mockery of the criminal justice system,
Wow.
and they're demanding immediate action.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have two very different stories
Yeah, absolutely.
from two different sources.
Two very different perspectives. And then you bring in Cwecwe's mother,
Yeah.
and she talked about this on the Hope Revolution TV podcast.
Right.
And she also had concerns about the principal,
Yeah.
but from a different angle.
Yeah.
She talked about how he hasn't really been helpful
Right.
and has even seemed to push back against things.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, why wouldn't he just cooperate
Yeah.
to clear the school's name if he had nothing to hide?
Totally. Yeah.
So that's another layer to this whole situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to get some clarity on this whole DNA thing, we should look at this pasted text source.
Okay.
So apparently the initial DNA tests that were done on Cwecwe,
Right.
they didn't actually find any foreign DNA. But the investigation did identify 3 persons of interest.
Okay.
And they wanted to get DNA samples from those individuals.
Okay.
For comparison purposes.
Got it.
But what's really important to remember here is that a person of interest
Right.
is not the same as a suspect.
Right.
It just means that the investigators want to take a closer look at them.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the MEC might have been saying that the principal's a suspect and that he's evading testing.
Right.
But Afroforum is saying he's not a suspect.
Right.
And then this pasted text is saying that there are these 3 people they want to look at, but they're not automatically suspects.
Right.
So it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. But the good news, I guess, from the pasted text is that SAPS has said the investigation is still ongoing.
Okay.
Even though those initial tests didn't find anything.
Right.
And they've assigned a senior investigator to look into everything.
Okay.
So at least it seems like they're still working on the case.
Right.
Even if we don't have any immediate DNA evidence.
Yeah. Okay. That is good to hear.
Yeah.
And all of this kind of leads into, what you were talking about earlier, like the bigger issues at play here.
Yeah.
With the police and with the justice system.
Right.
And I know a lot of folks listening are probably wondering, given the question we got about this, will Cwecwe actually find justice?
Yeah.
Given the issues that we have in South Africa.
Yeah.
With the system.
Yeah, that's a really important question.
And obviously none of our sources are directly saying that there's, systemic corruption or whatever.
Right.
In this specific case.
Yeah.
But, we do see from all these different reports that there are clearly challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
Within the system.
Yeah.
And there's definitely public distrust.
Yeah.
Which is understandable.
Mm-hmm.
We saw those reactions to other GBV cases that ENCA mentioned. And then you add in the fact that we have these conflicting stories about the principal and the DNA evidence and all that. And it just adds to the sense that, things might not be completely transparent.
Absolutely. And, even though we don't have proof of those systemic issues in this specific case,
right,
the fact that the minister himself acknowledged this worrying trend of GBV and femicide cases is pretty telling.
Yeah.
And the statistics that he shared are just frightening. Over 35,500 GBV and F suspects arrested, 4,500 convicted in just the past 2 years.
Wow.
I mean, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
And in the past week alone, 259 rape suspects arrested.
Wow.
Mostly in KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah.
And he even mentioned arrests of older men for alleged rape of minors.
Yeah.
Which just shows how widespread this problem is.
Yeah, and how ongoing it is.
Right, exactly.
But, I think it's fair to say that the police are at least trying to take this case seriously.
Newsroom Africa reported that the National Police Commissioner himself got involved.
Oh, wow.
And told this special unit, Family Violence, Child Protection, and Sexual Offenses Unit to take over the case.
Okay.
And they even deployed a senior officer to oversee it all.
Right.
So, they're putting resources into this.
Yeah, it seems like they're taking it seriously at a high level.
Right.
Which is good.
Yeah.
And the minister's statement, which is in the pasted text source.
Yeah.
He really stressed how seriously SAPS is treating this.
Right.
And how they're committed to finding justice.
Yeah.
Even though this is a difficult case.
Right.
I mean, he specifically said it's tough because there aren't any witnesses.
Yeah.
And it involves a minor.
Right.
Which makes gathering evidence so much harder.
Right. But, obviously the minister can't reveal everything about the investigation.
Right.
He did say in that pasted text source that they can't give out all the details.
Right. Because it's, a sensitive stage and the investigation is still going on.
Yeah.
But they are hoping to wrap things up soon.
Okay.
Which is good.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I understand why people are suspicious.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard not to be when you don't have all the information.
Right.
And especially given everything else that's going on.
Right.
But I think it's important to try and be patient and let them do their work.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to talk about Cwecwe's mother.
Yeah, absolutely.
What she's going through.
Yeah.
And she shared her story on the Hope Revolution TV podcast.
Right.
And also in that Boldy Awami interview.
Yeah.
And it's just heartbreaking.
It is.
She talked about the timeline of everything, from the alleged rape on October 14th.
Right.
And how Cwecwe's behavior changed afterwards.
Yeah.
And she was so frustrated with the school principal and the school board.
Yeah.
Because she felt like they just weren't supporting her. And then in that Boldly Awami interview, you could just hear the pain in her voice.
Yeah.
Malala Nganye, who was interviewing her, he even talked about how heavy that conversation was and how much he admired her strength.
Yeah.
It's just so sad.
It is.
To see what this family is going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's this essay infotainment podcast source, which actually names the school as Bergview College.
Okay.
And it says that they did receive that notice of deregistration.
Right.
Which apparently they're fighting.
Okay.
But yeah, the school is a big part of the community's anger.
Yeah.
And they're calling for the principal to be arrested.
Right.
Now, this podcast does use some pretty strong language.
Yeah.
Talking about untold secrets and exposed secrets.
Right.
But to be honest, it doesn't really say what those secrets are.
Yeah.
Beyond what the mother has already talked about.
Yeah.
You know, with her experience and her frustrations. So I think it's important to stick to what we know.
Absolutely stick to the facts.
For sure.
But what is clear from a lot of our sources is that there's a lot of activism going on around this case.
Yeah.
We've seen reports of marches in the news.
Right.
And this essay infotainment podcast also talks about it.
Yeah.
So clearly, people are really pushing for justice for Cwecwe.
Yeah, and I think that public pressure is probably why the police are going to be giving an update on the investigation.
Okay.
Newsroom Africa reported on that.
Right.
And even the acting mayor of the area is demanding information.
Yeah.
And arrests.
Right.
So they're really feeling the heat.
Yeah, they definitely are.
And this kind of leads into another one of these weird conflicting things that we've seen in this case.
Okay.
So the Minister of Police apparently said that the principal took a DNA test.
Okay.
But according to AfriForum and Cwecwe's mom, there's no evidence that he actually did.
Also, he said he did.
Yeah.
But they're saying he didn't.
Yeah, and in fact, the MEC statement that we talked about earlier implied that he was actually avoiding the test.
Oh, okay.
So it sounds like the minister might have been lying.
Yeah. It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely raises some questions.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder what else they might be hiding.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many inconsistencies in this case.
Right.
You've got the MEC saying one thing about the principal.
Right.
AfriForum saying another.
Yeah.
You've got the mother saying he's not cooperating. And then there's the whole thing about the DNA test.
Right.
And no one's been arrested.
Yeah.
Even though it's been quite a while.
Right.
And the school's been deregistered. And the principal's lawyered up.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that the minister can't give us all the details just adds to that suspicion.
Yeah, for sure. But, you know, just to clarify.
Because I know we've thrown a lot of different terms around.
Right.
This pasted text source makes it really clear that being a person of interest is not the same as being a suspect.
Exactly.
So the principal might have been one of the people they wanted to get DNA from.
Right.
But that doesn't automatically mean he's a suspect, even though the MEC said he was.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's possible that the MEC was just speaking based on what they knew at the time.
Yeah, that's possible.
Or maybe they had some information that we don't have.
Right.
But as far as we know from the police, he's not officially a suspect.
Right. Yeah, it's important to remember that the police are the ones conducting the investigation.
Right.
So their information is really what matters most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's safe to say that this case is incredibly complex.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's deeply disturbing on so many levels. You know, we have the emotional trauma that Cwecwe and her family are dealing with.
Right.
We have these conflicting stories about what happened with the investigation.
Yeah.
And specifically with the principal. We have these larger issues with the South African justice system that we've talked about.
And those other GBV cases that we mentioned really put that into perspective.
Yeah. And then, of course, you have the huge public outcry demanding justice.
Exactly.
So it's just a really difficult situation all around.
It really is. And our sources, you know, they've given us a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think, you know, given everything we've talked about today, like, what does it actually mean to pursue justice?
Yeah.
In a case like this?
Yeah. What does that look like?
Yeah. What does it involve? And what role does public awareness and pressure play in actually achieving that?
Yeah. I mean, that's something for all of us to think about.
For sure. So, yeah, I encourage everyone to keep following this story.
Yeah, absolutely.
See what happens as it develops.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks for joining us for another deep dive here on the Unseen Wisdom.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you found this discussion helpful, please like, comment, subscribe.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
See you.
For another deep dive.